Before the 2025 Louvre Heist turned the museum into a global warning sign, the Louvre looked like the one place where civilization should have been untouchable. It rises from the heart of Paris like a marble and glass oath. Civilization can be gathered, named, guarded, and placed under light. The pyramid catches the sky in geometric silence. Beneath it, the crowd moves like a slow human tide. Tickets ready, cameras raised, languages crossing. Far inside, the Mona Lisa waits behind her wall of faces. The winged Victory leans forward on her staircase, as if still arriving from a storm. The Venus de Milo stands under museum, light, broken, and eternal. Each corridor whispers the same promise. What has survived kings, revolutions, empires, and wars should be safe here. That is why the 7-minute rupture felt so unreal. Not because the Louvre was unknown, but because it was too known. Not because the objects were ordinary, but because the world had been trained to believe that a crown behind glass had been removed from danger. Security lines, polished floors, cameras, guards, velvet ropes, signs. All of it formed the modern costume of certainty. The museum did not look fragile. It looked ceremonial. It looked permanent. It looked like the final room where history, after centuries of violence, had been forced to behave. But the most dangerous weakness of a public museum is not always hidden in a wall or locked case. Sometimes it begins at the door that must open every morning. A fortress survives by refusing the world. The Louvre survives by welcoming it. That is the first crack in the postcard. The closer the public comes, the more the museum proves its purpose. But every step closer forces the same question. When civilization must open itself to everyone, how can it still remain as secure as a fortress? If the world's most famous museum looks untouchable, why does it need thousands of people to keep touching its edges every day? Now imagine the morning is the 19th of October, 2025. The museum is not asleep. Paris is not empty. The crowd is already moving under the glass pyramid pulled forward by tickets, signs, and the pressure of everyone behind them. This is not a movie vault. No blue lasers draw lines in the dark. No ancient tunnel opens under the scene. The rupture begins in daylight, inside a world-famous machine. In the Apollo Gallery, gold still glows above the room. Crown jewels sit under glass like small captured thrones. Then, the rhythm breaks. Alarms cut through audio guides. Footsteps change direction. Staff move visitors toward exits. The first truth arrives cold. A modern museum protects people before things. Not crowns, not paintings. Living bodies move first, because an institution that serves the public cannot sacrifice the public to save its symbols. The myth of the Louvre does not crack because it lacks history. It cracks because it is public. If the Louvre has to open its doors every morning, is the real weakness the thief or the door itself? Before the paintings, before the postcards, before the pyramid, there was a wall. Around 1190, under Philip Augustus, the Louvre began as a medieval fortress on the edge of Paris. The walls were thick. The ditch was wet and hard to cross. The tower stood above the river, watching for danger. Guards moved through narrow passages with torches in their hands. This was not a place built for visitors. It was built to make approach difficult, slow, and dangerous. Its strength came from a simple rule: the fewer people who could enter, the safer it became. That is the buried irony beneath the modern museum. When the Louvre was hardest, it was not yet generous. When it was most secure, it was not yet a sanctuary of art. No tourist route softened the stone. No gift shop waited near the exit. Back then, the Louvre did not persuade, teach, or welcome. It answered the world in weight. A ditch pushed every approach back. A wall cut the city away from danger. Above the riverbank, the tower rose in silence, like a warning written in stone. Its protection did not come from guiding people through space. It came from making space itself refuse them. Then the fortress began to change. Charles V turned it toward residents. Later, rulers opened windows, built libraries, gardens, staircases, and ceremonial rooms. Stone no longer existed, only to resist attack. It learned to frame power. Corridors became routes of permission. Rooms became stages. Architecture told people who could approach, who had to wait, and who was meant to look upward. This was the first corruption of the Louvre's identity. It did not fall. It became elegant. That is more dangerous than collapse, because elegance makes control feel natural. A wall that once rejected enemies started training insiders. The fortress learned to perform. Power no longer needed only thickness. It needed beauty. Once defense became display, the Louvre stopped being one thing. Its future weakness began there. In the moment stone discovered it could command attention. Would you rather stand outside a fortress that rejects you, or inside a palace that teaches you where you are allowed to look? Follow that command upward into the Apollo Gallery. The room does not whisper, it shines. Gold runs across the ceiling. Painted gods move through clouds. The sun is everywhere, because Louis XIV made the sun into a political language. Apollo was never just decoration. It was a ceiling built to make power look eternal. Beauty here was order wearing light. The gold did not simply impress visitors, it reduced them, making every person under the ceiling feel smaller than the system above. The eye rises because the room tells it to rise. That is the deeper trick. A visitor sees art, but royal power wanted something sharper, obedience disguised as wonder. The same logic would later expand at Versailles, where mirrors, gardens, and ceremony made the king appear like the center of gravity. In the Apollo Gallery, the lesson begins overhead. Look up, admire, accept the height. Then the jewels appeared: crowns, brooches, diamonds, pearls, emeralds, and imperial ornaments. Do not behave like simple luxuries. A crown behind glass is a portable throne. A dynasty made small enough to display. A marriage treaty, a coronation, a national memory, and a vanished court compressed into metal and stone. The glass does not kill the power. It domesticates it. A crown no longer commands armies, but it can still command silence, school lessons, national pride, and the slow movement of bodies around a case. Napoleon understood the museum as a stage of victory. Art taken through conquest could be arranged as evidence. A painting became more than a painting when it entered the capital of empire. A statue became a silent report from the battlefield. The Louvre protected civilization, but it also displayed how power collected civilization. That is why the 2025 theft feels larger than missing objects. It tears at the frame that says ownership has become harmless because it wears a museum label. If a crown stolen by history sits behind glass for long enough, does it become heritage, or does it remain stolen power wearing a museum label? In 1793, revolution opened the doors. The Palace of Kings became a public museum. The change looked like justice carved into architecture. Ordinary citizens could enter spaces once reserved for monarchs, courtiers, and controlled access. Paintings that had served private glory were placed under a new word: public. The Louvre became a symbol of a world turning against inherited privilege. The old palace did not disappear. It changed audience. What had once been staged for a narrow circle was now performed for citizens with the right to look. But the victory brought its own trap. Public ownership requires public entry. The crowd must come close enough to believe the museum belongs to them. Ropes, glass, signs, guards, and silent rules, still separate, seeing from owning. Moving through the galleries, the body crosses royal floors. But every barrier repeats the same reminder: access is not possession. The object belongs to history, to the state, to conservation rules, and only symbolically to the crowd. Napoleon intensified the contradiction. The museum that claimed to gather civilization also became a trophy room for conquest. Works arrived as proof that empire could move beauty across borders and rename the movement culture. This does not make the Louvre a simple villain. It makes it more uncomfortable than that. A protector of masterpieces and a witness to the unequal ways masterpieces travel. So when modern France says its heritage has been stolen, an older echo answers from other rooms. Many museums carry similar echoes: war, empire, purchase, diplomacy, pressure, excavation, and unequal exchange. The point is not to flatten history into one accusation. The point is to feel the boomerang. A museum can preserve memory and still expose the violence hidden inside the word collection. Then the modern machine takes over. The glass pyramid shines. Underground entries process bodies. Maps divide wonder into routes. Cameras blink above ticket lines. Phones turn masterpieces into proof of arrival. Gift shops wait at the end like soft exits from hard history. Millions come because the Louvre's famous. And the Louvre remains famous because millions keep coming. The crowd is now part of the museum's meaning. That fame is a security problem with a soul. A true fortress can refuse the world. The Louvre cannot. It must let strangers approach real objects, real rooms, real national symbols. Too much distance, and the museum becomes a prison for things. Too much openness, and every entrance becomes a crack. Too much secrecy, and the public asks what kind of civilization needs to hide in order to survive. Its greatness is not separate from its weakness. They are the same machine. In a crisis, the machine chooses life. The gallery clears. The gold ceiling remains bright while the human tide is redirected away from the room. Display cases keep their clean light, but the corridor empties. This is not a duel between guards and thieves. This is a public space obeying the rule that keeps it human. Bodies first. Objects second. The sentence is moral, and it is also terrifying. If the Louvre sealed every weak point, would it still be a museum or just a beautiful prison for objects? Every theft rewrites the Louvre. In 1911, the Mona Lisa vanished. The loss was almost absurdly small in physical scale. One rectangular absence on a wall in a palace of endless rooms. Yet the absence behaved like a shout. Vincenzo Peruggia took the painting, and for 2 years the empty space became louder than the image. People came to look at the absence. Newspapers carried the wound across borders. The wall did what the painting alone had not yet done. It made the Mona Lisa into a global ghost. The public learned to desire not only the artwork, but the story of losing it. When the painting returned, the myth returned bigger. The theft did not erase the image, it multiplied it. But the 2025 jewels face a harsher possibility. A painting can come back as itself and still be recognized by the world. A jewel depends on form. Remove the setting, separate the stones, melt the metal, and history begins to lose its name. That is the deeper fear, not theft, but transformation. Gold can stop being a crown. Diamonds can stop being a dynasty. A brooch can become fragments. An empire can shrink into material no label can recognize. The object may still exist somewhere in the world, but the story that made it priceless can be broken faster than stone. Once the shape is gone, recovery becomes more than a police problem. It becomes a fight against forgetting. The Louvre still stands. The pyramid still reflects the sky. Visitors still raise phones. The Mona Lisa still waits behind a crowd. The Apollo Gallery will be repaired, renamed, rearranged, or reopened. Officials will promise stronger systems. Visitors will return because the machine cannot stop without becoming something else. But something has changed. The museum no longer looks like pure certainty. It looks like old identities pressing against one another. That is why the world's most famous museum can feel as fragile as paper. It is not only a building, it is fortress, palace, royal theater, revolutionary symbol, imperial trophy room, public museum, tourist machine, and national myth layered into one body. Each layer demands a different rule: defend, display, educate, welcome, preserve, evacuate. Remember, this is your final choice. The Louvre can become a fortress again, but only by betraying the public it claims to serve. It can stay open, but only by accepting that every open door is also a crack in the myth. If civilization must be seen to survive, how much risk should it be allowed to carry? What do you do?